idea what he was going to talk about, but I thought I'm here to speak for 15 minutes. Actually, no. Good morning. Thanks for this. Just a quick ask on behalf of the university. Did anyone happen to take any photos in yesterday afternoon's session when the president was either speaking or thanking Isabel? And if you did, I would just ask you to email me one, but if nobody took one, this is a very simple matter. I know, this is just a quick thing that we were asked to do this morning.
There's a woman named Mitzi.
Mitzi? Oh, I know Mitzi.
Yeah, she said she took some pictures in one of those panels.
Yeah, she's in the other panel, right?
Okay, perfect.
So
I'll
I
ask
asked
her
her, because she told me she had some pictures of me on that last panel.
Okay, perfect.
And so I said, oh, she'd send them to me. So
All right, great. No worries. Sorry to interrupt. Enjoy your session, everybody.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kevin Lerner from Marist College, though I have left my name tag in the hotel room, so you'll just have to take my word for it. I can show you a passport if you like, and a name placard. We have an abbreviated panel this morning, but I think we have a very interesting and quite coherent panel, looking at some of literary journalism's past, and specifically, actually, Erich Maria Remarque and George Armstrong Custer, two names you don't necessarily hear at the same time, but I think we may be able to find some interesting parallels between them. So we only have two panelists this morning. I've been told James McLean is not able to attend. So it'll just be Tobias Eberwein and James Mueller this morning, and we'll start with Tobias, who's got Searching with the Good Eye Closed, Erich Maria Remarque, and the Politics of Entertainment.
Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for the introduction and good morning, everybody. Well, in my presentation, I'm going to focus on a study that is in fact part of a larger book project, which I'm working on right now. I'm working on it together with a colleague of mine from the University of Dortmund in Germany, my good friend Horst Pöttger. The book deals with the history of German literary journalism, and particularly on the role its changing relationship to power, you can say. I'm not sure if there's anybody, there are some persons in the room I know that were in the Porto Alegre conference last year. I'm not sure if you heard my presentation there, because I was talking about the history of German literary journalism there, and made some references to its origins and its very changeful history, which actually started in the 16th century, and had a very diverse history, not only with regard to the changing techniques of literary journalism, but also with regard to literary journalism's changing relationship to political power over the years, of course, in connection with the political history of Germany. So this last aspect is the particular focus of the book project I'm talking about. We want to analyze how literary journalism deals with political power. We want to find out which political and social functions literary journalism can fulfill, which strategies do they apply. And well, the book contains, in fact, a large variety of different chapters focusing on different German language authors, mostly from the 19th and 20th century. Theodor Fontane might be an example, Josef Roth, Karl Kraus, Erich Kästner, Ingeborg Bachmann, Christa Wolf, and many, many others. But today I would like to focus on one particular author, which is also part of this collection, the aforementioned Erich Maria Remarque, and the presentation focuses on what I call his concept of the politics of entertainment. I assume that the name Erich Maria Remarque is well known in this room. He's a key figure of world literature in the 20th century, of course, and I'm sure that you all associate with him his famous breakthrough novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, which is his most important piece of literature. It came out in 1928. In this novel, as you probably all know, he coped with his personal experience as a soldier in World War I. In fact, he had volunteered to join the German army at the age of 18, and he was then transferred to the Western Front in 1917. He only spent a few weeks there because he was wounded quite quickly. He was then repatriated to an army hospital in Germany, so it was a very short episode, but nonetheless it left a mark. Nonetheless, it left a mark on him. And this became the topic of his famous novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, which deals with the German soldiers' extreme physical and mental stress during the war, a topic that then later resounded in other novels by Remarque too. Of course, the pacifist tone of this novel wasn't greeted with much enthusiasm by the Nazi regime then, you can imagine. His books were blacklisted by the Hitler regime. Remarque had to flee to Switzerland first, and then his German citizenship was revoked. Eventually he decided to emigrate to the United States. He became a U.S. citizen later on. And while he continued to have a very productive life as a novelist, I listed some of his later novels on this slide here, you can read them out. Basically you can say that all of these novels are in a way gripping and skillful stories of personal crisis, of escape, of adventure, that in a way echo the author's personal trauma and the drama of his own life, his conflicting relationship to political power, so to speak. This is all more or less well documented in the scientific literature. I'm not focusing on the novelist Erich Remarque today. Interestingly, in contrast, there is hardly any research about his work as a journalist, which I'm going to focus on in my presentation. In fact, Remarque had a very productive career as a journalist, mostly before All Quiet on the Western Front came out. He was 30 years old when the book was published, but before that, he had worked for several journalistic publications. For example, for the Osnabrücker Tageblatt, which is a regional daily in his own hometown, the city of Osnabrück in northern Germany. He had also written for a business journal called Echo Continental, which is basically, initially it was nothing more than a PR journal for the tire producer, Continental. But it turned into something way more ambitious in the 1920s, also because of authors like Erich Remarque. He then moved to Berlin, where he became a quite successful editor of several publications associated with the Hugenberg publishing house. He worked for Sport and Bild, for example, where he wrote narrative journalism extensively. But really, as I said before, none of this has triggered much interest by research so far. And I think that is because of the apparent contradictions between the novelist Remarque and the journalist Remarque. So while the novels by Remarque are usually read as expressions of a pacifist tone, as expressions of a political agenda, the journalist Remarque is usually considered to be largely apolitical. He wrote for a mass market, he wrote entertainment pieces mainly. If you cast the first glimpse on that, and probably the interpretation is that these pieces are not worthy any further evaluation. For my study, however, I tried to contrast the journalistic works and All Quiet on the Western Front, and I think on this basis, on the basis of this analysis, it becomes possible to challenge popular assumptions about the journalist Erich Remarque. More about this in a few minutes. I have to make clear, however, that my analysis is not an attempt to, in a way, whitewash or glorify Remarque's journalistic writing. Not each of his publications was literary journalism par excellence. Certainly Remarque was not proud of all of them. In fact, I found several interviews where he talked about his work as a journalist over the time, and with these interviews he helped to cultivate two different narratives that may somehow explain how he felt working as a journalist. The first narrative goes that he worked for several journals mostly for the money. He had to earn money. That's the one narrative, and the other narrative is he did it to develop a style as an author, which he could build on later as a novelist. I in fact have collected two quotations which you can see here. I think they illustrate the two narratives quite well. The first quotation is from 1929, so shortly after the publication of All Quiet on the Western Front. He then told a colleague, you can read it yourself, some people have been so preposterous to accuse me, claiming that I wrote worse than today. And particular, they dribbled about a book which I was said to have written about the creation of cocktails. The truth is that I wrote a tiny article for a magazine 4 or 5 years ago. I could give even further material to those people because I wrote many articles, for example, about tires, the Continental magazine, you remember, about cars, about fold boats, about motors, whatever, simply because I had to survive. So the core argument here is he was a journalist to make a living, probably a more or less common narrative for many younger journalists, not only in that era, but today as well. In the second quotation, he goes a step further. This is from another interview, almost even more than 30 years later. He was talking about All Quiet on the Western Front again, and said, that was my breakthrough. All Quiet on the Western Front was my first book of that kind. Before that, I wrote quite differently, quite stupidly, in fact. I'm glad that they are forgotten. They are the journalistic pieces that he wrote. I am glad that they are forgotten. They were experiments. You are looking for a style. You do this, you do that. You are precious even. You try things as a young man. So this is what he says about his work as a journalist himself. He argues that journalism was his vehicle to develop a certain stylistic approach, which would later suit his novels, which would become important for him later on. And if he has this kind of argument about himself, it's no big wonder that research does not see any bigger merit in those pieces. But now we are coming to the but. I think that these arguments can hardly be contested, that's for sure, but at the same time there are also quite a few texts that go beyond this line of argumentation. So in a way, these texts help Remarque to develop a program or a kind of aesthetic that would soon become his trademark as a novelist. And I have a few examples that may illustrate this. For example, even in some of his very early writings, as a very young man, we find a certain criticism or a certain ironic distance towards militarism, which is of course so important for his later anti-war novels. This is one argument. Then there's the recurrent topic of the search for individuality, if you like to call it that way. It becomes apparent in the most different and sometimes the most surprising context. For example, when he writes about car tires again, or when he writes about the Berlin nightlife, but it is always there, the topic of individuality, the search for individuality. The same is then true for the motive of the individual confronted by an overpowering environment. This is, of course, one of the key issues of All Quiet on the Western Front, the powerless soldier in the middle of the war. But the motive also comes to the surface in many of Remarque's adventure reportage, for example. The individual coping with the force of nature, the individual alone surrounded by nature. This is a recurring motive. And then we can find many instances where Remarque probes into the use of storytelling techniques. That is important as well. For example, a narrative based on episodes, which he uses quite frequently, also in his novels, dramatic dialogues, a precise characterization of protagonists, and so on and so on. These techniques are, in a way, central for his style as a novelist, but he also uses it in his reportage journalism. And then, generally speaking, there are many, many texts which somehow float between journalism and literature, sometimes tending towards the one end, sometimes tending towards the other end, but the mixture is always there. So I think that taken together, these characteristics in a way show us that Remarque's journalistic work is by no means irrelevant. On the contrary, I would even argue that without his journalistic writings, his novels simply would not exist in the way that they did exist later on. So, and this is this finally brings me to my conclusion. I think that the analysis of Remarque's journalistic pieces demonstrates quite clearly, although I admit they are written for the mass market, and although they mainly touch light and entertaining topics, nonetheless they already contain many features that are characteristic for Remarque's approach as a novelist. Indeed, at first sight, the journalist Remarque seems to turn a blind eye on the imminent threat of Hitler's National Socialism, that's for sure, but at the same time, motives like the search for individuality also a criticism of militarism. They are already clearly visible. Moreover, Remarque uses his journalistic practice in search for a vehicle to modernize his aesthetics, to develop a reportage style that will soon become his trademark as a novelist. And this is why I believe that Remarque's literary journalism actually fulfills an important social and political function, just like his novels. The difference, of course, is that in his journalistic pieces, Remarque acts in a way under the disguise of entertainment. But his intentions are, in many instances, clearly political, and this is what I call the politics of entertainment. To some observers, it may seem that the journalist Remarque, in a way, lost track of the social value of his profession, or maybe he did not even find it yet. You can agree with that. But indeed, he may he may have acted with one eye closed, so to speak. But his other eye always had a clear view of the political surroundings. He was focusing on the political surroundings. He had a clear view of political power and its importance for the individual. And this is finally why I call for a reassessment of the role of Remarque's relationship to political power, not only as a journalist, but also as a novelist. So far, thanks for your attention.
All right, our other speaker this morning is James E. Mueller from the University of North Texas, and he's presenting a true insight into a cavalryman's life, George Armstrong Custer, as literary journalist.
Okay, thank you. When I was thinking about how to make this presentation relevant, since Custer's been dead for more than 100 years, I wasn't quite sure how to do it. And then Sonic came up and put him in an ad promoting a new frozen custard. So I don't know if anybody saw that where they live. It ran quite a bit in Texas, where I'm from, until people protested and they had to backtrack, apologize, take it down because people thought it was offensive and insensitive because of Custer's warfare during the Plains, or against the Plains Indians. And I thought it was pretty interesting because it shows how even though Custer's been dead for more than 100 years, he's still this really controversial figure and has become this vessel for interpreting various ways of interpreting American history and westward expansion. And the reason why he is that symbol is because he was so famous because he was a writer. I mean, he was famous because he was killed at Custer's last stand, but he was famous when he was killed, or that became such a big deal because he was a writer. Okay. And so I'm kind of making an argument that he was a literary journalist, and this is part of a larger project. I'm writing a biography of Custer now, and I got to the biography from writing that book there, Shooting Arrows in a Slinging Mud, which came out a couple years ago, and that's about how the press covered the little bighorn. And so with Mother's Day coming up, I think you can get it on Amazon if you're looking for a gift or something. But anyway, the biography comes out of stuff that I learned about Custer doing that research, which was that he was much more than a soldier. In fact, that was kind of his second career. He was a school teacher first before he went to West Point. All his life he was fascinated with teaching and education. He was fascinated with politics to his detriment, or his political career a couple of times when he got involved in campaigns. He was a big fan of theater and did a lot of amateur theatricals at Fort Abraham Lincoln. And he liked to write. And in fact, I think he saw himself as more of a writer. That picture on the other side shows him on leave in New York City the year he died in 1876, and he bought a new suit and so forth, and I think he thought of himself as more of a man about town and a cosmopolitan figure rather than a soldier. And so this biography deals with kind of what I'm arguing is a split personality that had this artistic ego that often got in the way of his military duties. And so I'm studying his writing and kind of making an argument that he was a literary journalist. And what I looked at particularly for this research is his most famous writings, which were a series of articles he did in 1872, 74, a couple years before he died, based on his campaigns in Kansas, Texas, and Oklahoma in the late 1860s. And he wrote them for Galaxy magazine, which was kind of a Harper's or Atlantic Monthly at the time in the 19th century, did a lot of literature and history and stuff like that. And reading, it was collected in a book called My Life on the Plains, which also was issued before he died. So he had kind of a best-selling author at the time of his death. And if you read through his stuff, I think it fits Norman Sims' definition of sketch journalism, that the precursor of literary journalists in the 19th century were folks who did a lot of sketch writing. And a lot of Custer's stuff was, his book was actually kind of a series of sketches, some of them humorous, whether we find them funny today, you know, it's open to debate, but it was kind of in a Mark Twain type style. And also, if you read through his magazine articles, you can find most of the techniques that we use to define literary journalism. And, you know, we don't have time to really go through all of them. I just thought I'd talk about 2 or 3 as examples. And the first one would be immersion. And of course, it kind of goes without saying. He was writing these articles about his own experiences fighting on the frontier, so he was immersed in it. But he was immersed in the sense that he was in the thick of it. He wasn't back in the fort as a general. He was out with the troops in the field. That's how he was dressed during that campaign in the dead of winter. Part of the campaign was fought in the plains winter, and so he was really dressed like a mountain man. And what he brought back to the readers was a sense of the cold and the harsh physical conditions, and then also the sheer terror of fighting on the plains. And he wrote a couple of evocative sketches about getting ready to go into combat and confessing that he wished he was anywhere else, that he had a feeling he wanted to get on his horse and ride in the opposite direction before they went into battle. But he said it was only this sense of pride, not wanting to embarrass himself, and also a sense of duty that compelled him to keep going and go into combat. And then he writes about going into negotiations with the Cheyenne and going into a village, and he only took another officer and an interpreter, just a couple of guys, went into the village alone, and one of his friends gave him a small pistol like that one, a single-shot Derringer, said, hide that in your clothing in case the negotiations go wrong. So as Custer wrote, I could be my own executioner, which was not really a job I wanted. It was kind of added a little bit of humor to it. And then he also used almost like this thick description, almost to ethnography, although of course he wasn't a trained ethnographer. He was specialized in engineering at West Point, like everybody did. But he wrote a lot about the geography of the plains. In fact, that's how he started. His first article was describing what it felt to live like on the plains for the people who were reading the galaxy back in the east, and talking about the vast distances and how it was, like a lot of people had described, he said it was like being on the ocean where you have this series of hills, and you would ride to one hill and you would think that you would then be able to see everywhere, but then you just see another hill in the distance. And so it was very deceptive, the distances and the mirages and stuff like that. And they wrote a great detail about the animals, like the buffalo, and talked about the buffalo wallows and how they would fight. The males would fight over the females, and then if they were all bloody, they would get in the ground and dig out a big wallow, a hole to kind of soothe their wounds. And then that would fill with rainwater, and it would hold the rainwater, and the water was so scarce on the plains that oftentimes, they would stop and they would drink out of the buffalo wallows. And he said we were glad to get it, not like in the East Coast where you would have perhaps cleaner water. And he talked about the Native American ponies, a great link, because he was kind of a horseman and people were interested in horses, and he compared them to the American horses and told how hardy the Native American ponies were, that they could carry a heavy load even though they were smaller, and they could run great distances, and they could live off the land a lot better than the cavalry horses, which they had to carry their own forage for. And he described it very evocatively, like he would talk about how when the grass was lower, it was winter, the native tribes would sometimes cut down cottonwood trees and cut them into lengths of like about 4 feet and toss them to the ponies. And then the ponies would hold them like a dog would a bone. They'd put a hoof on the length of log and then chew on it. He said it looked just like a dog chewing the bone. So it was really a descriptive writing. And when he would talk about a lot of native customs, as he got to see them in negotiations with the tribes, or they also had, of course, tribes who were their allies, like the Osage Indians would help them track down Cheyenne villages and so forth. And so he had a lot of contact with the native peoples. And he would write stuff about smoking peace pipes, marriage customs, and using the smoke signal. And he described in great detail how some of his scouts created a fire, what they used to create the small fire, how they got it going, how they would take the blanket off their shoulders, hold it close to the ground until the fire was almost dead, and then lift it up. And then Custer described how a beautiful egg-shaped white puff of smoke would come up and ascend slowly, and you could see it for great distances. And then he compared it to this painting here, which was from the 1860s by a guy named John Mix Stanley, called the Indian Telegraph. And so he was making a connection to what people at that time might have seen in art galleries and so forth. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Saying that it didn't look quite like that, but you know, if you've seen that painting, Custer wrote it was something like that. And through all of this, Custer developed his own voice. You know, we say most literary journalists have their own style. And Custer had a style of writing that, again, you know, it was kind of a little bit like some of Mark Twain's stuff. He had this self-deprecating style where he would make fun of himself, kind of humble, although perhaps a humble brag, where Custer always came out on top, you know, at the end. But he would be the butt of some of his stories. Probably the most famous one that's used in a lot of biographies of Custer is when they were marching through Kansas, or what is now Oklahoma, and, you know, kind of bored. He saw a buffalo bull, a big one, in the distance, and thought he would just take off from the column and shoot it so they would have buffalo meat that night, you know, and have fresh rations. And so he took off on his horse, and the buffalo took off, and so he just kind of got caught up in the hunt and rode for miles chasing this buffalo. And then finally he got close enough, pulled out his pistol, he was going to shoot the buffalo. The buffalo stopped, turned, started to gore Custer's horse. His horse reared up, and Custer was, you know, fumbling around and shot his horse in the head and killed it instantly. And so his horse, you know, dropped like that. Custer goes tumbling over. And then he wrote that as he was tumbling through the air, his one thought was, oh my God, I'm going to land down here right in front of this buffalo. But anyway, so he landed on the ground, came to his senses, and the buffalo was just standing there, looked at the dead horse, looked at him, and then just snorted and walked off. And the victor. And so anyway, Custer then wrote, you know, it's kind of a comic moment, the way he's describing it, but actually he was in the middle of the Great Plains, horseless, okay, and he didn't know where his troops were, because he had ridden so far. So it was really kind of a life or death situation, because he was in what was for him hostile territory, because there was an active war going on against the Cheyenne. And so then he describes, you know, trying to find his way back to his command. He didn't have a compass or anything, he was kind of guessing, and a bit of Custer's luck, he kind of walked in the right direction and came to the head of the column of troops, and so he was rescued, lived to fight another day, as it were. And then he also had a distinct point of view. You know, we often talk about literary journalists, you know, kind of, I don't know, opinion writing, editorializing, and so forth. And he had a distinct point of view, and the point of view, obviously, was of the U.S. Army and what it was like to be a cavalryman on the frontier in the 1860s. And surprisingly, to me anyway, it was kind of an anti-war viewpoint. Because Custer usually is portrayed as kind of a glory hunter. In fact, that was the name of one biography. But consistently throughout his magazine articles, one of the things that came through, he said he was resentful, and other officers were resentful, that the press and people living in the East would say the Army was creating these wars against the tribes because the Army wanted increased funding, or the soldiers wanted the glory of a war and so forth. And he wrote that the guys who served on the frontier, it was the absolute last thing they wanted. Because he said serving on the frontier was rough enough. Because you're out in the middle of nowhere in Kansas and what's now Oklahoma and so forth, way away from the creature comforts. And Custer was the kind of guy who liked his creature comforts. I mean, he liked New York City and that kind of stuff. And so he said the last thing he wanted to do was then have to leave these forts, which were primitive enough, and then go out and pursue an enemy that was really hard to find, really ferocious fighters. And then if you did find them and have a battle, he said you were damned if you did, damned if you didn't, because if you found a Native American village and you attacked it, then you would kill civilians and people would call you a killer. If you couldn't find a village or you couldn't find the hostile tribes, then people would say you were incompetent, you were wasting money, you didn't know what you were doing, you were just marching back and forth across the plains. So He said it was, basically kind of a lose-lose situation fighting on the frontier. And plus you had the harsh conditions, like that's a drawing from Harper's Weekly showing them marching through the snow in the winter. And he also, some of the stuff was interesting, his encounters with some of the native tribes. At one point he befriended one of the young warriors who was the son of a chief who they had imprisoned and were holding as kind of a hostage to try and force his tribe onto the reservation. But they let his son go back and forth as kind of a courier to try and encourage this other village to come in and surrender. And so Custer befriended him, and to pass the time, they would go out and have shooting contests. And he and this young warrior. And so they became friends, and Custer wrote that if you're reading this story, you probably think it's kind of strange that you have a warrior and a cavalryman having shooting contests and stuff. But he said it's a lot better than if we were out shooting at each other. It's better to have these contests and games. Then he also wrote about the madness of the government policy, which at the time was to give the tribes annuities, supplies, ammunition, guns, food, and so forth, and then at the same time expect the military to go out and fight against them. So that was his point of view. So my conclusion is I think Custer is one of these precursors of literary journalism from the 19th century. He took his readers to the plains, brought his own point of view. That's a picture of him in his writing study at Fort Abraham Lincoln. And I think Thomas Connery wrote in one of his books that there's so many literary journalists or people who could be that we should have a blank page where you could write in your literary journalist, just like early American newspapers would have a blank page and you could fill in your own news. And so I would say if I had that blank page, I would write George Custer as a 19th century journalist.
Thank you very much. All right, so our lack of panelists leaves us nearly a full hour for questions and discussions. Open it to the floor.
James, as you well know, Custer had a very distinguished career as a Civil War officer. Did he ever write about that experience?
He actually was writing his Civil War memoirs at the time of his death. In fact, he was writing during the Little Bighorn campaign. He would stay up at night and write, and he didn't finish it.
So that was his great unfinished literary nonfiction novel. Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because he had a lot of experiences in that. He went up in a balloon during the Civil War and all kinds of stuff. And I read something recently about how the military is studying lack of sleep, and they're changing the sleep routines for soldiers because the modern research shows lack of sleep is as strong as drugs and alcohol and so forth. But Custer was staying up every night late working on his memoirs during the Little Bighorn campaign, and I was thinking, like, I wonder if,
Bad decision making.
Yeah, the judge was there.
Interesting.
Has anyone, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
has anyone taken on finishing out the work?
Of his Civil War memoirs? Some guy collected them and just published them in kind of a book form, but didn't finish them out. But you can buy a book that has the articles that he wrote, but he only took it up to, like, I think the first or second year of the war or something. He didn't get to the battles that made him famous, like the Battle of Gettysburg and Appomattox, the final battle which he was involved in. So he never wrote about that stuff.
Did he keep a journal or have send letters where anybody could draw on those?
He didn't keep a journal. He wrote really voluminous letters. He would write 20-page letters to his wife and everybody. From West Point forward, when he started writing letters home, he would just write, and he would stay up after curfew at West Point, writing these voluminous letters. But no, he didn't keep a journal.
Two questions, one for both panelists. One is, I'll start with James since we're on the Custer topic, and then to Tobias. Custer was a big self-promoter, and so in his writings, and not only self-promoter for himself, but public for the U.S. government and the westward expansion. So in those writings, is it, did you notice whether or not there was sort of a desire to convince people that this is where they should be moving to as well? You knew that might read those writings?
Yeah.
To get them to move west?
Not in my life on the plains, but later on when he was writing other newspaper articles, and he was writing about the Black Hills, he did write about that as being great farming country, and wrote about gold in the Black Hills, and told other newspaper reporters that there was a lot of gold, and so that kind of led to the Little Bighorn campaign, because all the miners who went into the Black Hills were being killed by the Lakota who owned the Black Hills, and so then finally the government sent the army in, and that led to his death.
Was he by any chance getting paid by those people? Like
Was-
the people back east?
He had free tickets for the for the railroad, which they gave to a lot of army officers.
Okay.
So it was kind of a primitive PR in that sense when he was writing about the Black Hills.
So Tobias, Remarque is not the first novelist who was a journalist. And so I'm curious about his attitudes toward the journalism. I know you have the one quote where he basically makes some comment that he needed to survive, whereas people like Garcia Marquez they're still very proud of the fact that they were journalists, but Hemingway or Cather would say they rejected that whole period of their lives. How do you know how he really felt about being a journalist? I mean,
Now, I think that he did not have the highest opinion of his journalistic works himself. Somehow this could be seen in one of the quotations where he had this deteriorating view of what he wrote as a journalist. Basically speaking, he wanted to become a novelist at a very early age. He was aspiring to this high aim, but somehow he did not find a way to accomplish this aim at the very first. So he wrote to earn money, as I indicated with the other quotation, and that was simply a way for him to make a living. Eventually, when he had his breakthrough as a novelist, and he suddenly became a very successful and famous writer, there was much criticism about his early writings, because other observers found those pieces in the magazines, and well, they confronted him with it and said, what does this have to do with anti-war narratives? How can you ever take this seriously? And this particular criticism, I think, led him to, in a way, push away the early writings. I think this is a problem because this somehow guided all of the scarce scientific analysis of the early writings that is there. Because even Remarque himself had this critical view of his journalistic writings. But if you take a closer look, I think it was a rather quick reaction by him. Let's push this away, do not have a closer look at it, lest there could be any problems with it. So
in that journalism,
I think that is misleading in a way. So
well, like Custer, were there any literary qualities to any of that journalism?
Absolutely, in many cases. Although you really have to say it's produced for a mass market, as I said, and it's entertainment journalism. But you can always see, and you always have proof in it, in the statements in his early times, that he tried to find a deeper meaning in those journalistic pieces, even if it's just PR journalism, or pure adventure journalism. He did one of those large reportage for Continental. He took a folk boat out to Patagonia and was, driving through the waters and writing about his experiences. Basically, it was a PR initiative by Continental, who wanted to show we have those famous, those nice folk boats, and it's fun to be out there. But in a way, he tried to develop something bigger from this idea. And as I said, this motive, the individual and the overpowering nature, and the looking for yourself, which you would like to realize, and which you like to use to become acquainted with yourself, that was really important to him. And in a way, he sneaked that in through the back door, even if in those early pieces. And even if you do not expect this in those pieces, it's definitely there.
He's an amazing novelist. So.
Yeah.
Tobias, do you find that Remarque's journalism is worth studying on its own terms, or only in relation to, or sort of as a practice or a warm-up for the novels?
For me, it was a starting point to have a closer look, and the starting point was I have to take this point of reference in the case of his novels, because the novels are the point of reference that is usually used to come to a conclusion about the author. So this was my first approach. But starting to look into this early journalistic writing, I think there might be more to it. And this is a work in progress, really. I said that before. I only just started to make sense of this journalistic oeuvre. I will continue this study, and maybe there are further conclusions that lead us beyond all quiet on the Western Front. Right now, I cannot really say. But it's a starting point, and I think it's an interesting point of study, as it hasn't been studied very much so far.
This for Tobias as well. So is there any collection of his journalism, or do you have to go and sort of look through these the archives of these magazines to just find these pieces, or how did you come upon these
No,
pieces?
the last thing is the case.
Oh, really?
In the
Okay.
case of Remarque, there's no collection of
Oh,
journalistic writings. And I think this is a problem in the case of many of the German literary journalists in general, because this area has been largely understudied, and even in the case of the big names, only now the first collections of journalistic pieces are coming out, because scholars are starting to have an interest in that and are starting to do those collections. I would say that Remarque is one of the largely neglected persons as far as literary journalism is concerned, so it would probably take some time before we have a similar collection. We are only starting to have this in the case of the big names.
So how do you do this? Do you have I don't know. Did he write somewhere where he was published, so that you could go and sort of sift through all those the issues of those magazines?
You can use the newspaper archives, not by the companies, but they are well archived in most cases. I mean, the publications which I mentioned, most importantly, the Berlin-based publications in the Hugenberg Publishing House, they are available, but you have to go to the archives for that.
Continental is also archived, indexed and easy to track down?
In this case, it was a bit more difficult because basically, as I said, it was initially a PR publication, but
So was it not taken seriously by libraries as something to collect at the time?
not yet, no. But as I said, the publication has a long tradition. You can find earlier editions before Remarque wrote for that. They are not very well available. But during the 1920s, there was a clearly discernible ambition of the editors of this journal to make it more than a public relations magazine. You find many similar examples actually in that phase of German journalism during the 1920s, which was a boom era for narrative journalism. So many of the smaller publications that were available really developed a new approach to writing. And this is the era which I think is worth digging into and researching, but so far we're only starting to do that.
I wonder if George Armstrong, Custer, was aware that he was a journalist. I wonder because in the 19th century, of course, the journalism was the same that today or the 20th century. And in the 19th century, being journalist, it was not a choice. It was, I think, an accidental activity.
Yeah, I think, it also was considered more of a low trade, and Custer considered himself, I think, more sophisticated and aspired to be a writer of note as opposed to a reporter, which I think was considered less. Although he did write for newspapers, a lot of his newspaper writing didn't have bylines. Some of it because he was exposing stuff the government was doing or making political points he didn't want his name associated to. But I think he had pretensions that he would be a writer sort of like Mark Twain. And in fact, at the time of his death, he had signed with the Red Path Agency and was going to go on a speaking tour the next year, and Redpath was the agency that represented Mark Twain. So I think he thought of himself as kind of a higher level than a journalist. And also the Galaxy magazine, again, was, you know, aimed at upper class readers. So.
No.
But please.
No, go ahead.
Okay. On Custer, I was thinking on a similar example from Brazil. And it's funny because it would be in 1940s by perhaps Orlando Villas-Boas and his, because he was working with the indigenous people there, and the bit of Brazil, the country, was really opened in the quite recently, before the construction of Brasilia in the 60s. So, but it was a totally different example because it was not about killing buffaloes and Indians, but it was about protecting them and creating the huge reservations like Xingu. The interesting thing is that I read all his books and works, but it never occurred to me that we might consider an example of literary journalism. So I thank you. I will go back there and read them and see, because it's really quite, they are full of descriptions, you know, and dialogues and all of these sort of things. But because he was not a journalist, and I'm not familiar with any Brazilian article on that too, making this relationship between his work and literary journalism. So it's always good to learn, huh? To come here and have these inspirations. And about Tobias, it occurred to me that there was a Czech philosopher, Brazilian Czech philosopher, Willem Flusser, and you are aware of him. And it's interesting because he was not studied in Brazil, and but they started their archives in Berlin because he moved back to Europe, and he died in a car crash in Austria, I guess. I'm not sure. No, Czech, yeah. And there's this fine archive in the Free University of Berlin. And then the Brazilian researchers on communication start coming to Berlin and recovering the works in Portuguese. And now he's a really nice and splendid reference to think about communication and journalism in Brazil. And so the importance of this preserving this material, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Can only agree on that.
You know, there's an interesting parallel about this, and Brian, you were at London, 7 years ago, we were there, and I don't know if you saw this presentation. I'd have to ask Norm or David who it was, but one of the British members of IALJS, I think he's retired now, he gave a really interesting presentation about Dickens's precursor as a literary journalist. And about this now sort of famous story where he accompanied a member of the police department at night around the worst slums of London. And I don't think many people have ever heard of this until this guy did this presentation. And then it got pretty well known, at least in academic circles. And he was pointing out some of the same things, that there were experiments in what would later become the very Dickensian style in this and a few other early stories that he did as a young journalist. So I'm curious, I mean, it's just worth an observation, and I'm curious if you were aware of Dickens's early works as a journalist and see any parallels to what Remarque was doing.
Actually, I was at the London conference, I think 2010,
Yes,
right, if
yes.
I'm not mistaken. But I did not see the parallel at first, but now that you mention it, actually the narrative behind it sounds very familiar and very similar, and it might be worth to look for further similar examples, because this is probably the typical pattern in the formation of many literary journalists, of many grown-up writers that somehow needed their time to develop a style. And you can use the example of Dickens, of course, but also many, many other German language literary journalists. It was rather by chance that I started to focus on Remarque,
Yeah.
but the argument is indeed very good.
I think it's a book for you. It could be a book.
Yeah. If I have time, it's fine. Even in the future, I'll put it on my list. Yeah, but thanks for the comment. It's helpful.
I want to ask Jim, on Custer, Brian mentions a self-promoter. I think he's quite taken with his own place in the world and his own image. The picture you show is Custer being photographed under a portrait of Custer.
Yeah.
It seems like typical Custer. So my question is, when he reports on some of his encounters on the plains, has his voice and everything, can you trust his reporting? I mean, is he a reliable narrator of his own story? Because it's in his interest to glorify his own exploits, so that the incident of accidentally shooting his horse in the head, that's probably all true, but it might not have happened quite like that. And he might have been able to rise from the occasion and go, oh, there's my troops right over there. But and he told the story. He said, oh, I was lost miles away, so that there's a certain exaggeration here.
Yeah, I think there's no doubt, because I think, the journalistic standards were different.
Yeah, certainly.
Because the reporters who were covering Custer, the people he knew, they were always, and Mark Twain. It's
Yeah.
also, how much that Mark Twain wrote do we know was
Exaggerated.
true or was an exaggeration,
Yeah.
like Mark Twain's memoir of his brief Civil War experience, history of a campaign that failed. It's a really good story about him marching around with the militia in northern Missouri, but maybe a lot of that was made up.
Yeah.
So we don't know. But and other people, criticized his book when it came out. One general who was criticized by Custer wrote a reply in a pamphlet that was printed, my criticism of my life on the plains. And then one of Custer's subordinates, who hated him passionately, jokingly called it my lie on the plains. So yeah, I mean, some people disputed parts of it, but I think it was as trustworthy as most of the other stuff that was being reported in the 19th century.
I thought in your book you may want to include the possibility that the standards are different, and there's a certain amount of hyperbole in here. As a literary journalist, he's not held to a 20th century or 21st century standards.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's a different kind of journalism. It's like what Sim said, sketch writing and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, he's not Tom Wolfe or Hunter. Well, he might be Hunter Thompson, because I think Hunter Thompson made it.
Yeah, to Tobias again. I'm very intrigued by the politics of entertainment that you call, as you call it. And is there a specific? Could you give a specific example of just an article that would fit into this, or a story that he tells in which you feel that it's there's some kind of restriction to the sort of the ecosphere that he's embedded in, that he has, that to all those standards that he has to live up to in terms of being a writer, because he's going to get paid, right? So he can't really just write whatever he wants, but he needs to get paid. And how does this awareness sort of how is this reflected or manifested in a story that he's written?
Actually, there are quite a few examples that show this, but you really have to read between the lines to get to the deeper meaning. It's not openly political, and this is probably the most important argument about this, but you have to read between the lines. So if he manages to write a story about Berlin nightlife, so to speak, the bars, the clubs, the people that go there, it's a superficial topic at first sight, but he also manages to write about the loneliness of the individual in the large city and in the loud environment and so on. So this is this motive which I mentioned, the search for individuality in an anonymous large city, which comes to surface in those articles. Also, he did travel writing quite a lot
Yeah.
because of his job for Eco-Continental. So it's not only about cars, but the application of cars and the driving of cars to foreign countries and to do large travels and
Mhm.
to start adventures and so on. And also in these superficial cases of actually intending to show that you can use a motor car to have fun with it,
Yeah.
he manages to sneak in a message that is in line with what I just said before. So what does this mean to the person itself? What can it mean to the individual? And these are the examples that I might mention, and you can indeed find very lots of similar examples, and if
Yeah.
you take a closer look, you will find exactly what I mean. This is the politics of entertainment. It's entertainment journalism on a superficial level, but with a deeper
Oh.
meaning if you look closer.
Okay.
Yeah?
Mhm.
Any other questions? Great, well, it's been a great conversation. I want to thank the panelists again. Thank you for coming out. I'm sorry we didn't have a third person to talk to, but thank you everybody for coming this morning.